All right, good afternoon. I'm Rob Bernard, and thank you to Amy for inviting me. Amy mentioned a little bit, and I'll talk about this innovative program that we put together at Microsoft, but she also neglected to mention that she was instrumental in helping us put that together and rolling it out around the world. So I would be remiss if I didn't thank her for her help there amongst many other areas that we've worked together. We sit at the sort of jumping off point of a dramatic change in the way technology and human interaction happens, right? IoT, which is Internet of Things, cloud computing, which basically runs more and more of our society's infrastructure, is really emerging at an incredible pace. And the question for me as the chief environmental strategist at the company at Microsoft is, how do you enable this transformation and to do so in a way that is responsible to the planet, but also accelerates the changes that we want to see within the way we live? So, when we take a step back, can we go ahead and switch the slide? Paul showed some slides. We see them all the time, right? We know the world is physically changing. We can just look at, that was yesterday's forecast for Phoenix, 170 degrees, 124 degrees in India. We know our future reality, absent a change, is kind of intimidating. Next slide. Lake Mead, right? For those of us in the United States, this is certainly the case all over the world. Lakes going dry, regions going dry, lifestyles changing, food, drought. Next slide. The Arctic ice sea is like a train wreck. So it's easy to get discouraged. I've been doing this job for nearly a decade, a little over 8 years. And sometimes it is very discouraging. But on the flip side, the innovation is also happening incredibly quickly. The work that Paul was discussing is one example of kind of non-expected, non-linear breakthroughs that I think will continue to emerge. And I think the question for us is, how do we empower those creative thinkers around the world to go faster? Next slide. So I don't know how many people have seen this or this book, but the general concept, and there are a couple of books out there that are like this. There's another book called Resource Revolution, Al Gore's book, The Future, another book called Zero Marginal Cost, have similar themes, which is, the world is transitioning into a new industrial revolution. So if we think about historically where we've been, next slide. Right, what is actually going to happen in the fourth industrial revolution, which is built on the back of data, storage, processing, computing power? Right, historically, all the previous innovations and industrial revolutions, the first one with steam power and engines and the ability to do human manual labor faster, brought a whole wave of transformation to the way we live. The second industrial revolution, electricity and power and communication, allowed us to go even faster, but also to transmit ideas for the first time faster than we could physically move. Right? We also had the automobile, which changed the way we moved around. And then, at least according to this sort of version of industrial revolutions, the most recent one has been microprocessor, computers, PCs, right? Which led to all the stuff that we've experienced in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and the turn of the century. So the fourth industrial revolution is really about what does cloud computing and IoT do for all of us, and how it will disrupt, and already has started to disrupt, every single aspect of our life. How many people here are actually staying in an Airbnb instead of a hotel? Yeah. So when I travel, I stay in Airbnbs quite a bit. Come to the conferences with Uber more and more often than with rental cars, right? And these are sort of canonical examples. Mapping the human genome, 3D printing. 3D printing is actually kind of interesting. So if you think about resource, this is what we care about when we think about sustainability. You typically take something that's a massive resource and you trim it and trim it and trim it and trim it till you get your end product. And you take your waste and you hopefully put that back into the waste stream so that somebody else can reuse it, but more often than not it ends up in a landfill or causing some other environmental problem. Well, with something like 3D printing, think about the paradigm for a second. You put a bunch of ingredients in and you build and you build and you build from the raw material without the waste. So that's a transformation in the way manufacturing is going to happen. And when you read through the book, it talks about what percentage of all things that get manufactured are going to be like that. Well, that's a very different paradigm. Right now, the concepts which are super, super important about sort of circular economy, upcycling, recycling, yes, all those things are super important, but the waste stream starts to go down. That's very, very different. And so we'll see 3D printing in a different way. Next slide. So one of the things I wanted to think about when I was coming here is, I'm not familiar with Idaho. I live in Washington State. And a lot of times people come to me, especially people who want to get into the field of sustainability and say, hey, what can we do, right? Young generation, what can we do to actually make change? And the thing I often come back to is, what's the change you can do where you are, as opposed to going to seek some change or some path that might exist somewhere else? And so for me, I live in the Puget Sound. I actually live on an island out in the Puget Sound. And I thought it would be interesting to share with you, even though it's not Idaho, but you can sort of extrapolate and think about it in the context of being here. How can you use data and information to transform something that has been going on for centuries and is a very traditional way of life, not just for us, but also for the Native Americans, which is directly threatened by climate change? Why don't you roll the video, please?
And for 15 years thereafter, we successfully grew larvae, billions of larvae every year, without having to monitor the seawater. And it was around 2008 or so that the failures happened more regularly than the successes, and this whole issue came into focus for us.
I first heard about ocean acidification from some other scientists. I didn't think much of it, but then it became clear, especially through some news stories, that it was a big deal for local shellfish growers. They're very worried about the future of their industry. These are family businesses that have been going on for many generations, and the youngest generation can see that maybe there won't be an oyster industry for their children to inherit. A lot of people don't realize it, but 1 in 8 oysters consumed in the United States comes right from Willapa Bay on the Washington coast. They started having real problems growing the baby oysters there. They discovered that the reason was because of the acidification of the waters coming in from the Pacific.
It's taken technology to help find our way around this problem and manage this problem.
A big part of the science I do has to do with the flow of water in estuaries, which is the place where the oysters grow. And so realizing that the processes that we were studying and simulating on the coast actually were right now affecting these organisms in a really obvious and clear way.
Having the model to predict and tell us what the chemistry is in those bays and inlets, to tell us if the conditions are right or not to set those baby oysters, is really valuable.
Azure and cloud computing in general is transforming my ability to do this work. We decided to call it Live Ocean because we were trying to convey the sense that, well, this is really the living ocean. We're able to take all the computing steps that we had to do in-house and all the hardware we had to maintain and put it up in the cloud. Now, using the Live Ocean system, shellfish farmers can plan for when they're going to put out larval oysters and adapt to upcoming ocean acidification events. The thing that I'm most excited about in the future is really allowing all the people who live around Puget Sound and the coast here to give them a way of visually interacting with what the water's doing that they can't see underneath the water just from a boat, but that we can see in the computer models.
Now that we have these tools, we have forecasting tools and we have monitoring tools, and we're producing larvae successfully again, I feel optimistic.
So this is the kind of stuff that we see all over, but it's not just about the shellfish farmers, right? So this is actually across the street from where I live. My kids go and play down in the Sound all the time. And this is going to be a large, probably Dungeness crab at some point in the future. And so it's also the interaction that we as human beings, not just businesses, have with our environment that's at threat. So if the shells can't form and the animals can't mature, then the next generation, so my kids' kids, what is their exploration? What is their natural interaction with our environment? So it's about making this tie, and my kids aren't thinking about data and all that stuff, but we're thinking about, well, how do we actually use the data, and you saw the mapping of the estuaries and the flows, so that we're actually taking the right steps to keep the ecosystems healthy. So what powers all this? Data. Hundreds of thousands of square feet of data centers all over the world powering the infrastructure so that when Taylor Shellfish goes to put their oysters in the water and they want to do calculations, they can do it instantaneously. If you want to call an Uber, you can do that instantaneously. If you want to book Airbnb. We need to take this infrastructure for granted, and it needs to always be on and always be reliable. So the question, of course, is it's the data, but what lies behind the data? And so when I think about it, from my perspective, our biggest source of supply is energy. Right? It's people writing code, it's servers. That's relatively, if you will, static, gets physically put in, but the flow through of our supply chain is energy. Next slide. And so when you think about the energy, it's not just the energy coming from the power poles, and Nancy talked a little bit about this. It's batteries, it's storage, it's backup. So every time we build a data center, we build a power plant. Because if the power goes down, you still need your data. And we need to be able to actually replicate the data and move it quickly. So in Japan recently, there was a problem with an earthquake. Power went down. We had a backup infrastructure. We had a backup generator system. We had it all live. Nobody lost their data. Nobody even had a hiccup in their data, and we were able to transfer it somewhere else. That's what you expect, and that's what we need of the businesses of the world, and the governments of the world are going to run on cloud computing. So what you see there are generators, backups, and there are massive battery rooms. So one of the projects that we're actually working on with Nancy's, one of Nancy's investments is Primus Power. We just announced something at the White House a couple of weeks ago. This is a battery that's pretty innovative, actually, in terms of how it works. So for us, we say, look, lead-acid batteries, even lithium-ion batteries, interesting, but what are we doing to push the envelope on how we source our power? Because we need to get out of the business of having massive diesel generator backups and battery and lead-acid battery rooms. Next slide. So it is all about the power, as power is a key ingredient, and this is how we've traditionally thought about power. Next. For me, it's not about an instant or a certain deal that we do. Okay, so we can do Primus Power, we can do batteries. We've done micro fuel cells. We're doing biogas and using basically waste capture in Wyoming. We're doing other projects in other parts of the world. It's really about what is the behavior change that we need to instill at a company like Microsoft and the behavior change that's happening in companies all throughout the world. That is what's going to actually drive the transformation. Each of these things are just points and instances, and Project X or Project Y may turn out to be a failure, but if it's in line with the behavior change that we're trying to drive, that's how we're actually going to get to our end goals. So for us, it's about being transparent. I took this job on, like I said, about 8 years ago, and each year we become more and more transparent about what it is that we're doing, why we're doing it, what works and what doesn't work. We have to make sure that we have a clean energy infrastructure. So today, just to give you some scale, we use more power than a small state in the United States. And I didn't look, but I imagine we probably, on a worldwide basis, use more energy than the state of Idaho. And it will not be too far in the distant future, a decade or two from now, where companies like, and there's really only 3 of them, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, who operate at a massive scale in terms of energy and cloud infrastructure, we'll be comparing our energy use to small nations. And so when we take that responsibility and we think about something like Paris, and there are all these actors coming together and saying, we're nations, we're committing to X, Y, and Z, well, the question is, why wouldn't we commit to X, Y, and Z? So we thought about that and we said, yes, we're already carbon neutral. We're 100% renewable energy powered through all sorts of vehicles. But what's the next commitment? So we have a clean energy infrastructure, and I'll talk about those commitments in just a second. And we continue to invest in research like batteries, like fuel cells, like biogas. Next. So we said we'd do a number of energy commitments. Why don't you go ahead and just paint that? We're going to improve our energy mix. So today, a little bit over 40, around 44% of our energy comes from wind, solar, hydro. The rest comes from fossil fuels. So we said, even though we know that our numbers are going to grow dramatically in terms of our energy use as we build out the worldwide infrastructure to power the cloud, we're going to increase that number. We're going to get that number to 50% by 2018, to 60% by the turn of the decade in the 2020 era, and we'll keep growing from there. And that is in the face of significant growth in our overall base load. So it'll be a very interesting challenge, but we have to go meet it. We're going to continue to maintain our carbon neutrality. So 100% of our energy, the 44%, yes, that's nice, that's clean, but 100% of our energy will be clean energy through offset vehicles and something called renewable energy credits on a worldwide basis. And we will retire all of those attributes. I won't get into the geekiness of this, but it's possible actually to look at these things as financial swaps, whereas if you build a wind farm, you have some credits, they're worth a lot more in that state usually than in some other state. You could sell them and buy somewhere else. We're going to retire all of these things, so we want to prove that we're being additional, that we're helping accelerate green power on the grids where we operate. Next. We will continue to invest in new energy technologies. The deal that we're doing with the company that Nancy's investing in is just one example of that. There are a lot of those, and there are more to come. And we are actually actively moving into public policies. We filed with Google and Amazon and with Apple a briefing for the Clean Power Plan as an example. We will take an active role in thinking about what is our role, what's the appropriate place for us to weigh in. Next slide. And we're also trying new deal approaches. So in Virginia, the state wanted to increase its solar energy. It's a state that has a lot of potential, but not a lot of actual solar. Reminds me of another state that we might be sitting in today. So the state wanted to actually push this forward, but the legislation in the state, or the legislators, said no to the deal because of the price premium. So we came in and said, well, you know what? We have a big data center operation. We're active in the state of Virginia. Why don't we help you actually build that green power? So we did a slightly different financial deal that we don't think anybody else yet has done in the market. We hope to do more of them. And we created a three-way partner. Dominion, State of Virginia, Microsoft, created 20 megawatts of green power. Every green attribute will get retired from that project. And we're going to see if we can replicate this in other states. So it's not just about physical infrastructure innovation. It's also about financial innovation. Next. So I'm actually just going to touch on this briefly. I assume hopefully people know this. Microsoft, I said it before, 100% carbon neutral. In terms of scale, that's 14 billion kilowatt hours of green power that we purchased. We have 9.5 million tons of carbon that we've reduced, and we've impacted through carbon offset programs about 6 million people around the world, and I'll talk about that. So what does it mean when you impact 6 million people around the world? This is actually a photo that was taken 2 weeks ago in a village of one of the recipients of our carbon offset project in Africa. And this is their infrastructure, a bicycle and a solar panel. A year ago, neither of those things would have been in this picture, neither. They would walk, literally, round trip 10 miles to get water and to charge their cell phones. Walk 10 miles. Think about how long that takes you, right? Can't carry a lot of water as an individual, so it's a lot of people walking 10 miles. Now through carbon offsets, they have bicycles, so they can actually get to and from civilization faster, and they actually have power. And that, and I'll show you how in just a second, will power their cell phones. And that will actually get them online and communicating with the rest of the world. Next slide. So how does this work? This is one example. So M-Copa is a company in Africa. It's based on something called M-Pesa for people who know micropayments in Africa. The guys that designed that left Vodafone and started this company. And that is what you get if you live in a village in Africa for basically a small, very small down payment, a couple of pennies a day, less than you spend on kerosene to light your house today, less that you spend on charcoal. And at the end of a year, you own that system. Keep going, next slide. So this slide was done 2 months ago, 3 months ago. It had 333 households in a number of countries in Africa. It's now up to 500,000 households. Okay, at the end of the year, they'll own it. And this all runs, back to the theme, on cloud computing. So the way this works is you buy, you pay. It's all centralized control through cloud computing. And if people try to hack the system is monitored and controlled and shut off. But most importantly, through centralized machine learning, they're seeing all sorts of patterns, and they understand what's happening in the villages based on the energy profile. They can see who's using the power and who's not using the power. The other thing they can see is if your power starts to degrade, you might not notice it because you're charging your solar devices, but the central system sees it, and they can tell you, hey, you need to clean off your solar power. You're actually losing energy. One example that the owner of the company shared with me was that they had a fraud call. basically, somebody went to their sales rep and said, the MCOPA sales rep and said, your system doesn't work. My power, you guys are stealing my power. And they said, well, let's look at this situation. And they ran it through a bunch of algorithms. And they were able to pinpoint the time of day every single day, and it varied day by day, Monday through Saturday, when the power curve on the battery would drop precipitously. Turns out that's when the owner of the company would go run his errands, and all his employees would plug their phones in, drain the battery down. So now that's part of the employee benefits. 500 new homes get connected every single day, and they have 757 full-time staff, right? So this is what we think of as job creation, triple bottom line. Good? 4 countries, so they're growing rapidly, and we're working with them to do it. When the model works, this is like the Airbnb thing and the Uber thing, look at the growth curve, right? If you get it right, the demand is there, the transformation happens, and like I said, they're up to 500,000 and growing rapidly. Next. So for us, where we live at home, and I'll go through this very quickly, I always say you should start at home. Start where you are. If you're Taylor Shellfish, you're starting at home with oyster beds. If you're MCOPA and you want to go to Africa, you're starting with solar. We start with what we have. Next. We have 145 buildings, about 60,000 people, about 15 million square feet. We're 50 to 55 megawatt demand. Lots of energy demand. We're the single largest customer of Puget Sound Energy, the single largest customer. $60 million a year we were spending on energy, and we said, well, why don't we use data, IoT, sensors, to solve our problems? Next. Next. So there's our demand. We used a bunch of stuff, and you get really wonky about this. Next. And look at all sorts of curves. But I always say, look, there's 500 million data points being generated every single day on Microsoft campus. 500 million. In my first life, I was actually a building owner, construction, and management. If you told me I was going to have to manage 500 million data points a day in addition to managing a portfolio of 100 buildings, I'd say, yeah, thanks. I'm kind of busy. OK, but if you gave me this map in the morning and I could see red, yellow, green, paint one more, and I know, OK, I got utilities, faults, alarms, communication status, I go to red. I don't need to be a data scientist. I don't need to be a mathematician. I just need to understand basic intuitive behavior. This is the paradigm shift. Next. I can actually start to click and dig in. Next. I can see how much money each one of these faults is costing me. What data does, if you do it right, is it makes invisible things visible. But it also takes human insight as well to put on top of what you're going to do. So this is a chart for a new building that we built and opened. And we said, oh, that must be, I don't know if this works on a pointer. This must be the peak. That must be midday. Why don't you go ahead and paint once? That's actually the peak in terms of human behavior. One more time. We had the peak demand at midnight. What happened? This is a LEED gold building. We had it built and designed for modern specs. You have to stress test your building. So a vendor came in, stress test the building, turns everything on. Heating, air conditioning, lights, computers, everything at once to make sure the building actually can handle its load. And they set it as a test, probably for a couple of days, but they never turned it off. LEED design doesn't help you with that, right? So what happens is, this thing's running, and as hard as Microsoft people tend to work, I don't think there are a lot of people in the building at 1 a.m. So nobody noticed it. The machines noticed it. We were able to take corrective action. And this is a very important thing, which is things like design are super, super important, but it's only half the puzzle. So we had a building we renovated in Silicon Valley, again, LEED standards, and we turned it on, and in the first 30 days, $210,000 worth of money and a massive amount of energy that we saved because we realized by changing the setbacks on the air conditioning, on the boilers, on the chiller sequencing, we were just wasting energy. The building was designed really well, but when you look at people flow and what actually happens in those buildings, the data will show you things that you will never see. Like I said, my first career was running and managing buildings. We turned them on, we gave people the keys, and we went to the next space. That's not happening anymore. This is what's happening. Next. So then you take the data and you say, well, we have all these energy signatures from every building around the world. Why don't we take what we've learned and go deploy somewhere else. So now this is basically our internal heat map of offices that Microsoft has around the world that are over a certain size, because we have a lot more than these. And this shows us where we're going to go next to deploy these systems, and we're starting to roll them out around the world. Next. So I've given you a couple of examples. They exist in agriculture, they exist in transportation. I could spend a lot of time talking about water energy nexus and the data sets and what's happening there. But I just thought this would be interesting because it shows what is powerful when you think about data, IoT, and cloud computing. So why don't you paint it one more time? It's kind of hard to read, so I'll read it to you there. But basically it says that for every unit of carbon that's produced from the IT sector, about 9 to 10 units of carbon will be offset by what is possible. There's two problems with this analysis. One, it assumes that the IT operators of the world are using carbon to run their infrastructure. We're carbon neutral. So we're actually not emitting the first unit of carbon. And that's true also for a number of our colleagues. So that's the first mistake. The second problem with this analysis, it's linear. It doesn't think about the knock-on effects, and it doesn't think about the nonlinear applications, because it's done by projecting out based on existing thinking and existing infrastructure. So the one that was done 5 years ago and the one that was done 6 years ago, much different ratios. So when we sit in a place like this in 5 years, I suspect and expect, if the IT industry is doing their job right, that number will be significantly higher in terms of that multiple. Next slide. We still have a lot to do. The Sustainable Development Goals, multiple areas, disruption is going to happen. I firmly believe, where I started the talk, we are at the beginning of the fourth industrial revolution. It's incredibly exciting. It's easy to get depressed by the headlines and what's happening, but when you see the innovation happening on the ground, you see the hundreds and hundreds of projects happening all over the world, and you realize, Nancy mentioned it too, which is there are so many young people coming out of the woodwork who want to solve this problem. When I hired my first employee for this role, I had to go literally hunting for the person I wanted. I just hired another person for a job. I posted the job, and in 10 days I had over 300 applications. I had over 100 qualified applicants. It was really hard to choose somebody because there are so many people who want to do this work. And that is so awesome, because I know the other 299 people, they're not just going to stop. They're going to go find something else to do. And that to me is as exciting as any piece of technology or anything else we can do. One more. So I hope this helps broaden the conversation. We're hopeful that what we're doing broadens the conversation about sustainability. We're committed to this issue. I feel super fortunate to be able to know people like Amy and a lot of the folks in the audience. I know a lot of you folks as well. I feel like we're at the cusp of really driving innovation at scale. Thank you.